Welcome everyone. I'm Terry Emma, the director here at the Geneva History Museum. And yes, we are still here in the building. We're just not open to the public. You can learn more about what we're doing here during the closure at our fundraiser, which is September 17th at 7 p.m. It's a virtual fundraiser. You can sign up on our website. We'd love to have you join us. We're going to share all that we're doing here behind these closed doors. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. There's going to be cocktails made, and you can buy a cocktail kit, and then we'll show you some behind the scenes things here at the museum. But for today, I welcome you to our brown bag for the month of, what are we? It's September already. I still feel like it's March. So I have Sue here. Sue Anderson was born and raised in Seattle, Washington. She and her husband came to Illinois in 1966 to teach at Northern Illinois University. After she moved here, one of her cousins, who was into genealogy, told her that her great-great-grandparents had homesteaded in Illinois prior to the Civil War, and that there was a family cemetery located on a farm near Bloomington in Dry Grove Township in McLean County. That discovery sparked Sue's interest in Illinois history, and in 2018, she became a volunteer here at the museum. And we put her to work in the archives. She's also here at the front desk when we're open. But through Sue's research downstairs, she developed this brown bag about the nurses' letters from both Colonial and Community Hospital. I'm going to turn this over to Sue to share her program. Now, at the end of the program, you will be able to answer or ask questions. We have two ways you can do that. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and there is also a raise your hand button. So you could either raise your hand and we can let you in virtually, or you can type your question into the Q&A box. So this is our first time doing a webinar, so we appreciate your patience. This is being recorded, so anyone who did miss it can get a link to it on our website. Thank you, and I'm going to turn this over to Sue.
And I'm going to have to take my mask off to talk.
Once I leave your side, then you can take your mask off. Okay, here you go, Sue.
Good morning and welcome. I'd like to thank Terry Emma and Gail Mears for inviting me to be a part of the Geneva History Museum's Brown Bag program. My talk today will introduce you to a vibrant group of 77 women who graduated as registered nurses from the training schools affiliated with Geneva's Colonial and Community Hospitals between 1911 and 1935. I first learned about these women and this fascinating part of Geneva's history as a volunteer at the Geneva History Museum. I started volunteering at the museum in the fall of 2018. After a few months, Gail and Terry asked me if I'd be interested in organizing material relating to the hospitals that was housed in the museum archives. This sounded like a way to learn something new, so I said sure. Soon I was in the museum's reading room with files spread out on a big oak table. One file that caught my attention contained a handful of slim newsletters titled Alumni of the Colonial and Community Hospital's Christmas Letter. I could see the newsletters covered 2 decades, the 1930s and 40s, my parents' years. Curious, I dipped into the letters and was soon following these women's lives, fascinated to read what they had written about the tumultuous events of those decades, the Great Depression and World War II. The first nurse graduated from the Geneva hospitals in 1911, the last nurse in 1935. 33 women trained between 1911 and 1925 at Geneva's Colonial Hospital. 43 women trained at the Colonial Hospital's successor, Community Hospital, in the next 10 years. The nursing program was terminated in 1935 in response to the Great Depression. Nurses in training at Colonial Hospital lived together in a nurse's home and got to know each other quite well. They also worked long hours together at the hospital. Edith Bailey, who graduated from the training school in 1919, had this to say about the program. We worked from 7 to 7 with 2 hours off duty during the day and 1/2 day a week. When you were on night duty, you worked from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. without a break and all alone. I went on night duty when I had been in training 3 months, lost 3 patients during my first week, and though they were elderly, chronic cases, I was ready to quit training right then. It was the school of hard knocks. And when small training schools were scoffed at, I remember how surprised I was when I went to Children's Memorial to find the interns doing the treatment the nurses had done as a matter of routine in Geneva. Edith was a moving force behind the newsletters. She worked at Colonial for 10 years, beginning in 1916. Later, she worked as a librarian in Geneva. In 1950, she gave a talk to the Geneva Historical Society in which she reminisced about the early days. I hear Edith's voice in many of the newsletters, pestering people to send in their Christmas letters by the due date and keeping track of marriages, babies, job changes, accomplishments, and the doings of the association. Here is what Edith had to say in 1929 when she was president of the alumni. The name of our organization has been changed to include the graduates of both hospitals, that is, Colonial and Community. We were very glad to do this, and we needed some active resident members very badly. So we now have 10 new members, 44 in all. Edith continues, we spent $3 for the relief fund and about $75 on a chair, table, drapes, and paint for the room at the hospital. And we are now dickering for linoleum, which we hope to get for less than $100. In those days, the hospital rooms were furnished by individuals and charitable groups like the nurses' alumni. And here is Edith in 1947. She is now a librarian at the Geneva Public Library, but still acting as volunteer editor of the newsletter. 1947 was the last year, I think, that it was ever published. Edith writes, this is as much of a letter as we could afford, but felt we should not lose track of each other. The most of the responsibility of this letter was dumped in my lap rather unexpectedly, and I have done what I could by phone and card. I always insist I never will do it again. But personally, having met or known all of the graduates, I hate to see the letter discontinued. Nursing as a career. In the early newsletter years, job options for women were quite limited. The front page of the Geneva Republican from February 24th, 1922, clearly illustrates women's dilemma. On that page is an article about the new community hospital, which could not function without nurses. On the same page, there is an interpretation of law by the Illinois Attorney General denying women the right to sit on juries. Women could not vote in Illinois until 1913. Women could not be jurors in Illinois until 1939. What could women do as nurses? A letter from Nurse Pearl Dudley in 1929 says a lot about what nursing offered. She writes, I attended the International Congress of Nurses at Montreal this summer. It surely gave me a thrill to rub shoulders with nurses from all parts of the world. Considering the careers open to women in those days, I think nursing ranked near or at the top of the list. Geographical mobility was a big plus. According to Edith Bailey, only one nurse in training in 1919 was from Illinois, while there were 2 from Michigan, 1 from Pennsylvania, 1 each from Georgia, Oklahoma, Kansas, Minnesota, and Ireland. Edith recounts that before she was accepted into training, the nursing supervisor asked around to see if I came from a gossipy family before she would take me on. This was to prevent hospital news from leaking into the community. As to the movie poster shown on the screen, it dates from 1918 and presents an idealized World War I nurse. I see her as a woman on the go, taking charge, doing good, with a bit of heroism and adventure thrown into the mix. Hospital administration was considered women's work in the 1920s and 30s, and many of the graduates from the training program became supervisors and administrators. We will encounter Laura Elfstrom, Anna Borg, Claire Carlson, Edna Pearson, Della Int-Hout, and Pearl Dudley, Lincoln County nurse, Merrill, Wisconsin, as we move through the years. Teacher or lab technician were career possibilities. Hospital lab work was a new field in the 1920s, which opened science careers to women. Community Hospital pioneered a degree program for laboratory technicians. We now come to the nurses themselves. This is the 1924 graduating class, 2 supervisors and 5 nurses: Rose Deershaw, Claire Carlson, Verna Riskadal, Esther Johnson, and Marion Gardner. Laura Elfstrom, a 1920 graduate of the training program, was nursing director at the Springbrook Tuberculosis Sanitarium in Aurora from the late 1920s through the 30s. Tuberculosis was a major public health problem in the 1930s. At least 2 of the Geneva nurses ended up at Springbrook as TB patients themselves. Evelyn Gustafson was at Springbrook, taking a resting time, as she put it, in 1934. In 1936, Evelyn wrote, "After 3 long years, no, this is not a political speech, my health has finally begun to round that long corner towards improvement. I am hoping to soon don my uniform." Another nurse, Esther Anderson, was in and out of Springbrook as a patient for most of the decade. Writing from the sanitarium in 1936, she said, "I haven't much of interest to say about myself, as I have spent most of the year in bed. I started pneumothorax in August, and here's hoping." In 1937, Esther was still at Springbrook. She writes, "I am now in an 8 ward, so we don't have a chance to get lonesome. We play bridge evenings quite frequently, leather work, crocheting, reading, listening to the radio, and visiting take up about the remainder of our time, except, of course, resting." Happily, by 1939, Esther was out of the hospital and reported, short and to the point, "I've worked some, played a lot, and enjoyed every minute of the past year. My latest craze is bowling." TB sanitariums were challenging places to work. Ruth Henthorne Hoover in 1936 said, "I had been quite busy this fall, doing 8 and 12-hour special duty at the Chicago Municipal TB Sanitarium. They have 1,200 patients. This is quite the place to be nursing." The next year, Ruth was still doing private duty in Chicago. "I've had several very interesting cases. A lobectomy, where 2 lobes of the lung were removed. Recently, I have had thoracoplasties and hemorrhage cases. Nurses in Chicago are doing 8-hour duty, which gives us all more work and rest, but the pay is $2 less too." By far, the most venturesome career path that I encountered among the Geneva nurses was that of Della Int-Hout, who graduated from Colonial Hospital in 1919. By any standards, Della led an exceptional life. She was a born storyteller And her Christmas letters were what really caught my attention and started me thinking about these women's lives. Della was born in Thornton, Illinois in 1893, one of 12 children. She was 26 when she became a nurse. In the 1929 newsletter, Della was reported to be in Harvey, running the obstetrics department, working every minute, has big clinics for the mothers, rashes, pediatrics, and works in the garden between times. She weighs 120 pounds, so life must agree with her. Had a nice trip to Hot Springs with her mother this fall. By 1933, Della had jumped ship for a horse, so to speak. She was now a nurse with the Frontier Nursing Service, a group of horseback riding nurse midwives who dedicated their lives to bringing health services to the rural poor in the backwoods of Kentucky. Why did Della decide to join the Frontier Service? My guess is she was inspired by a silent movie called The Forgotten Frontier. This movie, which you can watch on YouTube, came out in 1931. It was a promotional piece made by the Frontier Nursing Service, featuring real nurses, not actors. "Merry Christmas to you all from the land of saddlebags," Della wrote in 1933. The photos shown here are stills from the movie, but Inti's stories of Kentucky are the real thing. A nurse on horseback bravely fords the Kentucky River to reach a mountain shack where a woman in labor needs help, something Della did with regularity. There was adventure aplenty in this kind of nursing, and it's clear that Inti, as she was called in Kentucky, thrived in the Frontier Service. In 1937, she founded a clinic in memory of her mother. One time when the Kentucky River was running high, she swam her horse, Carmenetta, across at an unfamiliar ford, only to land in quicksand. This is how she described the event. "I had to think quickly. My stirrups were lying on the sand. Carmenetta was into her belly, and my weight was sinking her further. I rolled off and continued to roll in order to distribute my weight, as I knew I couldn't stand. After a few minutes, I found myself on firm ground and stood, trembling, watching Carmenetta attempting to save herself. She was panting, and it was a sight to the world," the natives said afterwards. They thought she would never make it. She was smart. She kept plunging and causing the water to rush in and distribute the quicksands, and backing herself gradually so that she was able to get back into swimming water. I could hear her panting. The saddlebags were full of water as she hit the middle of the river and swimming down towards me. I kept running along the edge of the river, she watching me all the time until I thought I had found a firm bank, firm enough to hold a horse. I stamped on it and called to her. She hesitated, but I continued the stamping until she was reassured that all was well. And then the dear, brave little soul came swimming towards me and landed in safety. It's plain from Inti's letters that she enjoyed the personal side of nursing. She wrote this about one of her maternity patients. "The little mother said she was right proud, that is, glad to see me, and I knew how she was feeling. The last couple prenatal calls, she had related how a black snake had wound itself around her hand as she put her hand into a hen's nest for eggs in the dark. And she didn't like to name, that is, mention it, but she was afeared the baby would be marked. She said she had studied and studied over it ever since, until she was most unhappy. I again assured her the baby would not be marked, and we sat down before the great fire, hemming diapers and talking of other things, she saying she was proud I was there with her, as I was cheery to bide with. Little Minta came before sundown, unmarked, beautiful baby. Promoting public health, things like childhood vaccinations, was a major focus of the Frontier Nursing Service. Yesterday, Bella writes, I wormed 25 kids in a school, then went on to do 2 postpartums, then another clinic with 15 worm treatments, 5 prenatals, babies with toxoid, and what have you. In a mountainous region where privies were scarce and the water supplies contaminated, worms were a major problem. Inti writes in her 1933 letter, some of the children are so wormy that you are called because the child has fits, literally eaten up by worms, the fit being caused by the round worms getting up into their throats and strangling them. Hopefully, many of the issues, health-wise and otherwise, that defined the 1930s are never to be repeated. But you never know. One of the things that interested me was the sense I got of the moods of the times, of what it was like to live through the Great Depression. I'd like to explore these moods in the next few slides. The years 1930, 1933 were the depths of the Great Depression. The range of personal reactions to the Depression in the letters from 1933 fascinated me. The Depression has not got us yet, although we feel the strain considerably at Community, wrote Mildred Benson. Another year has rolled by and not any better than last year, if not worse. Cliff hasn't had any work for 2 years, and neither have I. If things keep on like they are at present, we'll spend our next Christmas and New Year's at the county farm. This from Hazel Bogren Dahlquist. Because of monotony due to this depression, I have lost interest in writing. This from Carla Gordon, who was writing from, but I hope not residing at, the Municipal TB Sanitarium in Rockford. Well, old man depression doesn't seem to be making very much change in its duties. Have had some work, but not much, but am thankful with what I have had since last year. I am very busy, making a hooked rug out of silk stockings, and I'm having a grand time. This from Helen Peterson in Geneva. Esther Anderson, who soon ended up as a TB patient at Springbrook, writes about losing her job. A year ago last August, I was supervising obstetrics, and the 1st of December, I was offered the position of superintendent of nurses. Had 28 students, and learned some of the troubles of checking up on students, wondering many times if we were as bad as the ones I had. Well, finally, the depression got us down, and the training school was discontinued, and yours truly wasn't working anymore. Can't say that I was sorry so far as the job was concerned, but I needed the money. After staying home for a month and a half, I came out to Elmhurst and registered, was called for general duty 10 days later, and so far am still here. The most philosophical comments from 1933 come from Irish nurse Ann Keenan, who was boarding with Edith Bailey when she wrote this. Can it be a year since we wrote last? So little has happened to me as an individual, and yet there is so much happening all around us. The NRA, Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration, working overtime to keep the big bad wolf at a respectable distance. The dollar shrinking until it is almost diminutive. Rumblings of war rumored from abroad. Well, anyway, I hope we shall all live through it and be the bigger and better for the experience. It is an interesting time, to say the least. History in the making. By the end of 1934, things were picking up. Carla Gordon's monotony had dissipated. She had gotten married and moved to Walla Walla, Washington. She writes a long letter about their 6-day drive from Illinois to Washington in their Chevy coupe, exclaiming, In the sagebrush hills of Wyoming, we spied a coyote. In some of the nurses' experiences, you can glimpse the influence of Roosevelt's New Deal, particularly the implementation of the 8-hour day and the work programs instituted by the Civil Works Administration, CWA, a short-lived 1933 program to put jobless Americans back to work. Helen Ojala, who had just graduated from the training program in 1933, writes, I was put on at one of the grade schools in Chisholm, Minnesota, as a CWA nurse, assisting the regular school nurse and doctor, thereby learning a lot. 1935 was better. Mildred Benson had abandoned slow times at Community Hospital for married life on a Montana cattle ranch and had a young daughter. Mildred writes, probably little Margaret Ann will ride a horse before she walks, a carnation milk baby. Hazel Dahlquist was no longer worried about ending up at the county poor farm and was gloating over Dudley Clifford Dahlquist, a living recommendation for lactic acid formula for babies. For me, the most interesting letter from 1935 was from Della Int Hout. She had taken a leave from the Frontier Nursing Service to study for certification as a nurse midwife at an innovative clinic in New York City. This facility, the Lobenstein Clinic, was located in Harlem at a time when nursing was, for the most part, segregated. After graduation, Inti flew back to Chicago from New York nonstop. This is what she wrote about the flight. The best of all was my trip home on the United Airlines. It took only 4 1/4 hours to reach Chicago, and I enjoyed every minute of it. The clouds and the blue sky with the gold of the sun on it all was like fairyland to me, and I couldn't believe that Harlem and baby cases ever existed. A nurse stewardess cared for us, fed us, and entertained us. Would any of you like a job like that? There are 10 on the United Airlines. But she adds, to be back with my horse Bonnie is what I am looking forward to now. I leave for the mountains next week. Optimism was on the rise from 1936 to 38. Work was more plentiful, and almost everybody seemed to be taking a long auto trip out west. I love this comment from Ruth Henthorne Hoover. We were in the ditch just once, which we thought not bad for 5,000 miles. There were trips to Europe too, reunions with family members not seen in decades. Ann Keenan and her sister traveled back to Ireland for a family reunion, the first in 29 years, and to visit her 81-year-old mother. Another nurse, Laura Anderson from St. Charles, traveled with her mother and several other relatives to Denmark to visit her mother's brothers and sisters, which her mother had not seen in 50 years. Laura did not speak any foreign languages, but she had a great time shopping in Copenhagen, nevertheless. One thing that struck me vividly about the late 1930s was the great disparity in living conditions between cities and rural areas and between the prosperous and the poor. Among the decidedly prosperous was Marie Leet, who in 1939 was married to a district manager of a Chicago manufacturing company. The up-and-coming couple had bought a home in a charming residential suburb 20 miles from Detroit, and Marie had remodeled her kitchen in the Swedish style. Her redo had been featured in a ladies' magazine. The most arresting feature of the kitchen, according to the magazine article, was the disappearing sink. The disguise, the article said, consists of a light plywood cover with an apron extending down over the front edge to meet the cabinet below. In the top is a trapdoor, giving access to the sink for such minor activities as drawing water. Of course, for dishwashing, the light cover is easily lifted off and stored in a closet adjoining the kitchen. At the opposite end of the convenience scale was Verna Riskadal's farmhouse in Shabana, which still did not have electricity at the end of the decade. Yes, Verna writes in 1937, we are moving in March about 9 miles southwest of DeKalb on a farm with no conveniences. The electric line is within 1 mile of our place, but they have to have 3 families to a mile or they will not come out. She writes that her husband George had almost decided to sell out and move to Chicago, but she thinks it's better to raise children on a farm than on the streets of a big city. There were pockets of real poverty in the Tri-Cities in the late 1930s. Judith Johnson, who was the school and community nurse in Batavia in 1939, wrote this: there are many things that happen to make life more exciting at times, such as helping our chief of police in one of our poor colored homes with a delivery, most of the work over with before a doctor could be located. Of course, it had to happen on a Sunday night. Only 1 kerosene lamp, plenty of neighbors on hand, no equipment except for a few newspapers. Most of the letters from 1939 are upbeat. Only a few nurses expressed their worries about what was happening in Europe. Helen Ojala was one of them. These are troubled times in the world about us, she wrote, but we can all be doubly glad to live here in the USA. We have relatives in Finland and are deeply concerned about them. Russia had invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939. Sina Gunderson Golf was also worried. She had children in Norway. She had planned to visit them that summer, but this horrid war interfered with my plans. The newsletters from 1941, 43, 44, 45, and 1947 reveal how quickly and drastically World War II changed life forever in the United States. Sons and daughters deployed overseas, overtime work in defense factories, gasoline and food rationing, shortage of manpower on farms, shortage of nursing staff in stateside hospitals, civilian volunteers acting in new and expanded roles, the wide world made smaller. These themes fill the letters from the war years. Short-staffed hospitals relied increasingly on volunteers during World War II, and degreed nurses were called on to teach skills to civilians. Thelma Glass described a course she taught in 1943 under the auspices of the Office of Civil Defense. The course was titled Male Nurse Aides, and it met 2 times a week from 7 to 10 p.m. Thelma wrote, there are now over 100 men who have been trained by this course, volunteering their services to hospitals. The class which I have are men ranging in age from 27 to 60, and mostly business and professional men. Incidentally, there are 2 ministers in the class. Volunteers also played a crucial role in the fight against polio. Pearl Dudley Van Heck, who we met as a Wisconsin county nurse in 1929, was during the 1940s the Wisconsin Advisor of Women's Activities for President Roosevelt's Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the March of Dimes. She was subsequently awarded Wisconsin's Theodora Yeomans Award for her notable contribution to good citizenship. During the war years, Community Hospital was both short-staffed and overcrowded. Lillian Leff described the situation in 1944. Am still doing general duty working nights on obstetrics. With the shortage of nurses and the difficulty in getting the laundry done, It makes the work a chore, but we are meeting the situations day by day and manage to keep going. We get discouraged many times, but everybody does their share, and all will welcome the times when this is all over and everyone will be home again with us. Edith Bailey added this note to the newsletter about the alumni meetings. Meetings have been held every month. Red Cross sewing was available, so there were no idle hands. Volunteers from community hospitals, Women's Auxiliary, helped to can and freeze produce from the hospital Victory Garden to feed the patients. The auxiliary had 176 members. Several nurses were employed at local defense industries, including Howard Aircraft in St. Charles, where Mildred Archer Sallows was head nurse. Evelyn Gustafson didn't name where she worked, but gave a colorful description of her defense job in 1944. It is industrial nursing in a vital defense plant in Geneva. The work is very interesting, though my hours of 3 to 11 p.m. give me no time to visit any of my friends. The plant has excellent post-war opportunities as it specializes in the manufacturing of electronic tubes. The tubes are very intricate and interesting, and it is surprising the many uses they have. Farming also suffered from manpower shortages during the war. Several nurses married to farmers recounted how their teenage and even pre-teenage daughters and sons had stepped up to fill this breach. I, frankly, was amazed at the initiative these young people displayed. Verna Riskadal wrote this about her daughters in 1943. Thankfully, by then, the farm in Shabana had electricity. Rose Marie, 11, and Roberta, 10, both drive the tractor. George made a cart for them on rubber tires on which he placed a large tank of water. This they draw AM and PM to the pigs at the south end of the farm, and it takes them an hour each time to care for the pigs. You see, they are a big help to their daddy. They also bring up the sheep every night, a big chore. The Riskadals were running 128 hogs and 200 head of sheep at the time. Another farmer's wife, Dorothy Sager Weir of St. Charles, spoke proudly of her son Carl in her 1944 letter. Her husband, Harry, had been in a farm accident, which resulted in compound fractures of his arm and required 2 surgeries. Dorothy writes, with the health situation what it was the past year, it wasn't exactly a picnic, handling all the work of a large dairy on a 265-acre farm. Then she recounts, our Carl, although only 10, cut all the grain with the tractor. We surely are very proud of him. He has been such a help to us. Many younger nurses joined the armed services. Mildred Churchill, who had graduated in 1935, joined the Navy in 1939. Among those joining the Army were Jean Marion Gardner, Judith Johnson, Catherine Worth Everly, and Dorothy Litsu Rudback. Letters from the battle zones were, of course, censored, but even the fragments that made it into the Christmas letters tell quite a tale. Here is part of Mildred Churchill's letter from 1944. Mildred writes, reluctant to leave the Hawaiian Islands as I was, I nevertheless was thrilled at the opportunity to make the return trip by clipper, accompanying a patient who had been injured at Guam. Mildred continues, my term of duty at Pearl Harbor included experience as assistant chief nurse and chief nurse. The islands are as beautiful as the tourists' pamphlets describe, and the weather is ideal. Making the most of my time there, I attended Hawaiian luau picnics to us and tried surfboard riding. I say tried because that's as far as I ever got. Turning serious, Mildred continues, Our patients are brought to us in hospital ships and transports from Tarawa, Saipan, the Marshalls, Tinian, Inuitak, Bougainville, Guam, Palau, Peleliu, and many other islands. Judith Johnson, who had left Batavia to become an Army nurse, was in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium in 1944. By signing her letters with the APO address of 298 General Hospital, she implied a lot without revealing much. She writes, "We were the first general to start working in France. Since we came here, we have been kept continually busy. Right now, we seem to have more Germans than our own boys as patients. If you could only see for a short while all of the problems involved in being here, it would make all of you wonder at the fact we are progressing as well as we have in winning the peace. It's surprising how much even a letter has gotten to mean to us. The other day, I got a bottle of olives from my brother, and several of us had a real feast. I am so tired now, I can't think straight." Edith Bailey adds an addendum to Judith's account. A later letter tells us that Johnny is now in Belgium, close to the German border. On the screen is a picture of an Army tent hospital in Belgium. There's another Geneva nurse who served overseas that I'd like to honor here, Vivian Ekstrand Wilson, who served as a lieutenant in the US Navy in the Philippines. Vivian was a graduate of the Augustana Hospital School of Nursing in Chicago, so technically she was not an alumna, but she worked as a surgical nurse at Community Hospital. She donated photos of her war service to the Geneva Museum, where I discovered them. There's quite a difference in the way Vivian looks in her Navy dress uniform in 1942, ready for church, she says on the back of the photo, and in work boots, a sun hat, and what looks to me like skirts in the Philippines in 1945. Vivian included pictures of the US Fleet Hospital in eastern Samar Province, the Philippines, where she worked. V.J. Day was August 15th, 1945. The end of the war was greeted with a burst of emotion. The Geneva Republican for August 17th described it this way: "The end of the war with Japan, announced in the White House in Washington, D.C., shortly after 6 o'clock last Tuesday night, was echoed throughout the world, and Geneva, a typical Midwestern city, reacted promptly with a wild celebration, blowing of whistles, ringing of bells, and exploding firecrackers and guns, and the noise of automobile horns." V.J. Day also put an end to gasoline and food rationing, which had been enforced since May 1942. Alida Larson Swan writes in December 1945, "Tonight, while writing this letter, I have a pan of brownies in the oven, made from real butter, now that it is point-free." For the most part, personal comments about the end of the war were muted. Ann Keenan expressed it this way: "Greetings on this, our first peacetime Christmas for 4 years. God has been good to my sister and myself. All the boys are coming home gradually from different parts of the globe. If we can only be successful in winning a just and lasting peace, there is so much unrest. One wonders." Gladys Louise Barnes also expressed lingering doubts. "Now that the atomic energy has been discovered, people are fearful of what will happen next." Sina Gunderson Golf captured the anxiety which so many people must have felt during the war. Sina, it will be remembered, had intended to visit her children in Norway in 1939 and had been prevented by the outbreak of war. Writing from Community Hospital, she says, "Lots of things have happened since last year. Most important in my life is that the war is over and I am again able to write to my folks. They sent a telegram as soon as the war was over, and a letter followed shortly. My father passed away September 1943, and we received the sad news in 1945. I was able to send them packages for Christmas this year. One never realizes what a privilege it is to be able to send Christmas presents until it is taken away from us. How awful it was to go through the stores at Christmas time and not even know whether those you cared for most in life were tortured, dead, or dying. So I am enjoying this Christmas, first of all, for the real Christmas gift, the Savior, and second, for peace on earth. Here, Sina hesitated a little, adding peace to some extent. Gratitude for small things, for family, for friends, for community. Gratitude for small things is a theme that runs throughout the nurses' Christmas letters, from the first to the last. Among the nurses working at Community Hospital at War's End, a sense of pride in their hospital was evident. Community had been extensively remodeled and redecorated in 1945, and the nurses were proud of where they worked. Community has been all dressed up, Mildred Carlson writes. More detail came from Anna Borg Olson. We are all thrilled with the rejuvenation of the hospital. Every bit of space has been well used. Finally, Naomi Peterson Ermeling writes, I wish you could all come to visit us in our newly remodeled hospital. From the new doctor's room in the old delivery room to the grand new plastic cribs in the nursery, it is all so wonderful that I could go on for hours and hours. Do try to come. We would be proud to take you on a tour of the place. And here, with Naomi's delight in the new plastic cribs, which were actually lucite and stainless steel, I end my tour of the Geneva Nurses Christmas Letters. Thank you for joining us today.
Sue, that was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. I should
Absolutely.
put my mask on.
Anyone have any questions? I'd be glad to, if you'd like to type them into the Q&A box, or if you'd like to raise your hand at the very bottom middle part of your screen. I'm happy to open up your video and let you ask a question. We'll try our best to answer. But if no one, it was so thorough and it was so delightful. I love that you used the letters and you read them with the spirit that was intended probably behind them and with the emotion. So
thank you.
Beautiful job. Thank you, Sue. She did the entire thing herself. Here I've got very nicely done. Thank you. There you go. Someone sent us a nice little message. Appreciate that. She did do an excellent job, didn't she? Well, again, as you know, this was recorded. I will send out an email with the link to the recording so you could share it with someone who didn't get to join us today. Also, don't forget our fundraiser is next Thursday evening at 7. You need to register ahead of time. The link is on our website. We're going to have a lot of fun virtually with all of you and raise some money for the museum, because right now especially, we really need your support. We're going to invite all of you to become GEMS, which is giving every month, which we would love to have you become. Even at a small amount of $35 a month would be very helpful to us. You'll hear more about that at the event. Also, next Brown Bag will be virtual again in October. We're going to celebrate the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy coming to Geneva on October 25th, 1960. Amazing. So join us. We're going to share some stories. We have some video interviews from people who were there. We're also going to open it up for people to share their own stories if they want to join us. So that'll be a really fun program as well. Another wonderful program. So enjoyed learning about the times. Thank you. Thanks, Claudia. Appreciate the good news. and the good vibes. We love that. Here's some more. Here's a Q&A. What was the title of the movie Forgotten Frontier? She's wondering, was it called yet?
Yes, it is called The Forgotten Frontier. It's available both on YouTube and through the National Institute of Medicine. The US government is probably the best way to look at it. I'll get Terry to send you a link so that you can look at it there. It's very nicely done.
Excellent. Thanks for the question. See, we're new at this too, so we really appreciate you guys giving us this opportunity to test drive our new Zoom webinar. It did cost us, the museum, a little money to upgrade, but I really think it's going to make a more professional program for all of us. And I appreciate all of you participating today. Again, look for us, October brown bag. November brown bag is also going to be virtual. We're going to share and reveal the new mural painted for our 18th century creche. And you'll learn the story from the artist himself as his inspiration created such a wonderful painting for us. So it looks like that's all, unless I see anybody else. Let me check the screen, make sure no one else raised their hand or sent in a message. This is great. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the participation. Wish we could all be together, but we will be soon. And we're going to share with you your awesome museum here in Geneva. You won't believe what's going on behind these walls. You may think we're sleeping in here, but we're sure not. All right, we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone. And take care. Thanks again, Sue. You're an awesome volunteer and a good friend.
Thank you to the museum for inviting me.
Bye, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.